Now you're going to see why we say vote Thom Hartmann in as the next president.
A government shutdown is looming 2 weeks away unless Republicans and Democratic lawmakers can hammer out a new budget, and recent reports suggest the two parties are tens of billions of dollars apart at the negotiating table. Meanwhile, Republicans are already positioning themselves to wage the next war, cutting Social Security. They claim that if you want to really get tough with deficits, then you have to get tough on entitlement programs, right? Well, is this true? Yesterday, Senator Bernie Sanders appeared at a back-off Social Security rally and had this to say about that critical program.
Social Security has worked. Today, instead of 50% of the elderly being poor, the number is too high, but it's down to 10%. If you want to talk about the deficit, talk about the wars. Talk about tax breaks for billionaires. Talk about the Wall Street bailout. Don't talk about Social Security.
This month, Senator Sanders also released his own proposal to cut the deficit that doesn't throw seniors and the working class under the bus by ripping apart America's social safety net. Senator Sanders joins me now from Capitol Hill to talk about this issue and the best ways forward for America. Senator Sanders, welcome.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Great to have you here. I had on my radio show today a Koch brothers funded think tank guy who said with a totally straight face and said he had all the numbers to back it up that by 2040 all of our tax dollars are going to pay for two things, the national debt or interest on the national debt and Social Security, and everything else will be wiped out. True?
No, not true at all. In terms of Social Security, what you have right now is an enormous amount of misinformation being thrown to the American people. The reality is that Social Security has a $2.6 trillion surplus. The reality is that Social Security hasn't contributed one nickel to the deficit because it has a surplus. And second of all, it is funded by payroll tax. Every worker in America, virtually every worker, contributes 6.2%. His or her employer contributes 6.2%, and that's what makes up the Social Security Trust Fund. Social Security can pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 26 years. The attacks on Social Security are not based on finances, they are based on ideology and politics. The right wing, the Republicans, Wall Street don't like Social Security because it is a government program that has, for the last 75 years, worked extremely effectively, paying out every nickel owed to every eligible American, and as the clip that you played indicated, it has gone a long way to reducing poverty among seniors, helping people with disabilities, and widows and orphans as well. It is a government program that is working, which is precisely why our Republican friends don't like it.
Senator, why are these guys, and even the President's Commission, constantly bringing Social Security into the discussion about the budget deficit?
Well, I think for two reasons. They're trying to confuse the American people. On one hand, they're saying, look, we have a $1.6 trillion deficit, therefore we've got to cut Social Security. No, absolutely wrong. It doesn't add up. Social Security has a $2.6 trillion surplus. Social Security hasn't contributed a nickel to the deficit. As I mentioned yesterday, if you want to look at the deficit, look at two unpaid wars, maybe a third unpaid war in Libya. Look at the tax breaks, the hundreds and hundreds of billions we've given to the wealthiest people in this country. Look at the Wall Street bailout. Look at the Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the insurance companies, unpaid for. Look at the recession, which is resulting in less revenue coming into the government. Those are the reasons why you have a deficit. Now, the point that we are making is that if you want to deal with Social Security, if you're really worried about beyond the next 26 years, then what you want to do is lift the cap on income so that millionaires will be paying more into the Social Security Trust Fund than people who make $106,000 a year. That will essentially solve Social Security for the next 60 or 70 years.
Senator, speaking of the budget deficit, from the George Washington administration to the Ronald Reagan administration, other than a few bumps for a few wars that we resolved fairly quickly, we basically had no functional budget deficit. It was under $1 trillion when Ronald Reagan came in. Reagan cut taxes on billionaires down to 28%, and the budget deficit, or the debt, exploded. Clinton raised taxes on billionaires to 39%, and we got a budget surplus. Bush cut taxes back down to 36%, and we're back to budget deficits. Why won't anybody talk about this really simple math instead of always ranting about spending?
Well, Tom, that's an excellent point, and you're quite right. The Republicans clearly have won the narrative. When you talk about a budget, you're talking about two things: spending and revenue coming in. We have given hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 2%. Today, the effective, the real tax rate for the richest people in this country is the lowest on record. Corporations, who in general are enjoying record-breaking profits, in case after case after case, are paying zero in taxes, very little in taxes, or in many cases, they're actually getting refunds from the IRS. It seems to me that if we're serious about deficit reduction, you can't simply do it, as the Republicans want, by cutting Head Start and throwing hundreds of thousands of kids off that program, cutting Pell Grants, making college education unaffordable for millions of middle-class and working-class families, cutting the Social Security Administration, which will make it harder for eligible beneficiaries to get what they're entitled to in a timely manner. You can't do it by cutting EPA alone by 30%. You've got to raise revenue. And what the Republicans are saying, yeah, we want to balance the budget, but we're going to do it on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the poor, those people who are most vulnerable. What I am saying, and others are saying, but not enough, is you need shared sacrifice. You've got to ask the wealthiest people in this country to also contribute to deficit reduction. You've got to ask corporations like ExxonMobil, which a couple of years ago made $19 billion in profits and ended up paying nothing in taxes and getting a refund from the IRS. You've got to start asking those large corporations to start paying taxes as well.
Senator, you proposed legislation to tax millionaires, and Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky broke the news of her proposed tax for millionaires sitting right here next to me on this show a few weeks ago. Do you think either of your proposals, yours in the Senate, hers in the House, will gather steam as more and more average working people realize how badly they're being screwed?
Well, I can tell you this, Tom. There was a Wall Street NBC poll a couple of weeks ago, and this is what the poll said. What do you think the best way is to move toward deficit reduction? 81% of the people thought that a surtax on families earning $1 million a year or more was a good idea. 81%. Then they said, people, what do you think is the worst way to go toward deficit reduction? And people said, don't cut Social Security. So the American people believe in the concept of shared sacrifice. They think when the wealthiest people today are doing phenomenally well, their taxes have gone down, they should contribute. So the American people are already there, and I think the more they learn about the issue, they will be there even more. The problem is, obviously, in this Congress, you have a whole lot of folks, Republicans and some Democrats, who are not looking at the needs of ordinary people, but rather at the needs of the very, very wealthy. But I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure the people on top play a role in deficit reduction, and you just don't balance it on working families or low-income people.
And to that point, Senator, with the 2 minutes or so we have left, doesn't this really speak to the corrosive impact of money in politics and the whole how the political landscape has changed since Citizens United? And what can the average citizen do about this?
Well, it certainly does speak to the role of money in politics. I mean, you just look at it, Tom. First of all, in terms of good public policy, the right thing to do. You don't cut back on Pell Grants when so many families today are desperately trying to get their kids a college education. You don't cut back on the Head Start program when we know that it is enormously successful in preventing kids from dropping out of school. You don't cut back on EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, when the vast majority of the American people want to make sure that we're breathing clean air and that the water we drink is safe. But because of the power of money in Congress, the power of lobbyists, the large corporate interests who wield so much influence here, what you're seeing is Congress, certainly the Republicans and too many Democrats, are just looking at spending cuts. And the debate is, well, do you cut this and how much do you cut, rather than saying what is the fair approach, what is the best approach.
Very well said. Senator Bernie Sanders, thanks for joining us tonight.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so Americans, I suggest we all close our bank accounts with Bank of America, and we never again pull into a Exxon Mobil station.
Senator Sanders, an amazing man. Well, I have a plan to protect Social Security also, and mine will also revive the economy. Let me tell you about it. It's pretty straightforward stuff. It's called Cash for Geezers. It starts out with a theory that David Ricardo, arguably the second or third most famous economist in history, back in 1817 laid out. He called it his iron law of wages. And it basically says that when you've got a lot of unemployed people, wages crash. And when the labor market tightens up and you've got more employers looking for workers than there are workers, in other words, then wages go up. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. So the goal to raise wages, which increases taxes, is to reduce the workforce, right? To reduce the number of people looking for a job, reduce unemployment by reducing the workforce. So my suggestion is drop the eligibility age for Social Security to 55 years old. Right now it's 65. Drop it down to 55, maybe even 50. What this will do is a couple of things. First of all, only about half of the seniors around will take advantage of it. A lot of people like working after they're, in their 50s and 60s and 70s, but about half of them would probably take advantage of it. And by doing that, what's going to happen is half of those people, which is, a few million people, are going to remove themselves from the labor market. Now, when you get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million people pulling themselves out of the labor market, suddenly your unemployment rate drops like crazy. Unemployment rate goes down, and what happens? Wages start going up, because now employers have to compete to get good workers. As wages go up, guess what happens? People are earning more money, they're paying more taxes. So the increase in tax collections from this program pays for the increase in dropping the Social Security eligibility age, and in the process rebuilds the middle class. The variation on the same thing is what France did back 15, 20 years ago, thereabouts. They were having a recession, and they said, okay, how do we reduce our labor force? Now, instead of taking elderly people, or I don't know, 55 is elderly, instead of taking older people out of the labor force, what they said is, we're going to cut the work week from 40 hours down to 35 hours. Which is pretty much where it still is. And in doing so, what they did is they actually reduced unemployment, drove up wages, and it increased tax collections. So there's a precedent for this. The theory works. As I said, I call it Cash for Geezers, and I'd love to see it tried.
Now you know why we want Thom Hartmann for president. And we can use that Bernie Sanders, the independent, maybe he can be in charge of the Treasury.